An 89-year-old man suffered humiliation just for asking for a simple sandwich at a cafe. A wealthy woman, surprised, noticed something on his wrist and froze as she approached to find out what it was. Her face became expressionless. Before we begin the story, comment below where you're watching this video from. Enjoy the story. As the cafe door's chime sounded softly, its echo spread across the room, and Hakim entered, almost like a stranger in the indifferent routine of others. It was early afternoon, and the sun's rays shone through the windows, illuminating the tables with a warm touch. But that light wasn't enough to soften Hakim's tired and aging face, his 89-year-old features worn. His steps, slow and shuffling, and his eyes, kind yet marked by the fatigue of decades of stories and regrets, led him to the counter. With a barely audible voice, he asked for a simple sandwich, as if needing permission to occupy that space. Maria, the cafe owner, looked at him with an impatient gaze. She was a middle-aged woman with hard features and an air of perpetual dissatisfaction. She sighed, making no effort to hide her coldness, and replied almost indifferently, "Do you have money to pay?" she asked with a suspicious tone, as if ready to deny the order at the slightest hesitation. Hakim nodded and began searching through the pockets of his worn coat, pulling out some faded coins. Meanwhile, some customers watched the scene with mocking looks. Whispers and spiteful laughter echoed through the room, with no one bothering to hide their indifference. The scene might have gone unnoticed, just another subtle act of daily cruelty, if it weren't for Laura. Seated near the window, she was watching the situation closely. Something about the way Hakim was being treated deeply disturbed her. Laura was a woman of natural elegance, with graceful movements and a gaze that seemed to see beyond appearances, as if she could read people's stories just by observing their gestures. Seeing the way Hakim was being treated, she stood up and walked to the counter with determined steps, never taking her eyes off Maria. "I'll pay for the sandwich," she said, placing a bill on the counter. Her voice was soft, but with a firmness that made Maria hesitate for a moment, surprised by the intervention. Finally, Maria took the money and prepared the order in silence, adding nothing more. When Joachim looked at Laura, his eyes were filled with immense gratitude, and he gave her a shy, almost embarrassed smile. He murmured something in such a soft voice that his words seemed to vanish into the air, as if he feared being a bother. Laura returned a warm, comforting smile. "Don't worry, it's no bother," she replied. "Sometimes we just need a little kindness." They both sat down, and while Hakim ate his sandwich, Laura observed every detail. It was then that something caught her attention. On Hakim's wrist, an old, well-cared-for watch gleamed softly under the cafe's light. It was a simple yet elegant design she recognized instantly. Laura's heart raced, and a wave of emotions washed over her. She remembered that watch. It was identical to the one she had given to Vinicius years ago, when they were still dreaming of a future together. The memory of Vinicius returned to her mind like a lightning bolt. His smile, his promises, the nights filled with conversations and plans. With a trembling voice, Laura pointed to the watch, trying to control the unease she felt. "That watch. Where did you get it?" Hakim looked down at his wrist, softly caressing the metal as if it were a cherished object. "It belonged to my son," he replied, his gaze lost in the past. "Vinicius gave it to me before he left." The name hit Laura like lightning, leaving her breathless. "Vinicius?" She could barely murmur, feeling a mixture of surprise, sadness, and hope. Her voice broke as she remembered the man who had been the center of her life and whom she had lost so tragically. Hakim, moved by the intensity of her reaction, nodded. "Yes, my son. May God have him in his glory. He was everything to us, and losing him destroyed us." His eyes filled with tears and his voice cracked. Laura remained silent, processing what she had just heard. She looked at Hakim, as if trying to piece together a puzzle she had never known existed. "I knew Vinicius," she finally said softly. Hakim looked at her directly, surprised. "Are you Laura?" he asked, trying to confirm what seemed incredible. "He always spoke of you," he added with tenderness. "He said you were the reason for his smile." Laura felt tears burning in her eyes but managed a faint smile. "And he was my reason too," she whispered, with a pain that reflected all the broken promises and moments that never came to be. In front of Hakim, she felt a deep understanding, a bond that connected her to someone who shared the same pain. The cafe transformed into a space filled with unspoken emotions. Laura realized that somehow fate had united two wounded hearts. The watch that once symbolized her love with Vinicius was now a link to Hakim, the father who had also lost his son. Without saying anything else, Laura gently took Hakim's hand, feeling the warmth and fragility of his fingers. They both left the cafe in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Laura suggested a walk to a nearby park, a quiet place, away from the gaze of others. Hakim nodded and followed her in silence, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions flooding over him. In the park, the wind whispered through the leaves as if sharing ancient secrets. They sat on a wooden bench, and after a few moments, Laura broke the silence. "I never imagined finding someone who could understand how I feel," she said, her voice soft and reflective. "Losing Vinicius was like losing a part of myself." Hakim looked at her with gentle, weary eyes. "You were important to him," he said with a sad serenity. "He always spoke of you as if you lit up his life, something Cecilia and I perhaps couldn't do anymore." Surprised, Laura realized just how much Vinicius had shared with his parents about her. "What was it like for you?" she asked, aware that her words might open old wounds. Hakim sighed, his voice filled with sorrow. "Vinicius was our only son. Cecilia and I always tried to give him the best, but over time he became distant, and our conversations were filled with silences that spoke louder than words." His gaze drifted into the distance. "I didn't understand his distance. But now, after talking with you, I'm beginning to see that perhaps there were things I never knew." Laura felt a pang of pain. Vinicius had told her about his inner conflicts, the feeling of being trapped by expectations he thought he could never meet. "He wanted to find his own path," she explained softly. "We had plans. We wanted to build a life together, away from everything he felt was holding him back. But then the accident happened." Laura's words brought back painful memories. For a moment, she relived Vinicius's smile, his laughter, the dreams they had shared on long nights. "I never knew how to deal with this pain," she confessed. "I tried to move on, but I always felt trapped in that moment when everything fell apart." Hakim listened to her in silence, sharing her pain without the need for words. "After losing Vinicius, Cecilia and I lost ourselves too. She couldn't bear the loss, and her sadness ended up separating us." Tears began to fall as he spoke, recalling the family they had once been. Now shattered by grief, Laura looked at him, surprised. "Did she leave?" she asked. Hakim nodded, his face marked by the weight of years of memories. "Cecilia never accepted Vinicius's death. She blamed him for growing distant, and when he was gone, that blame turned inward. She couldn't bear to be at home, where everything reminded her of our son, so she left, as if she needed to run away from everything, even from herself." Hakim's confession left Laura speechless for a few moments. She imagined that devastated mother, trapped in pain and despair, unable to find peace. The thought of Cecilia wandering the streets while Hakim survived alone moved her deeply. "And you? How have you managed to go on?" Laura asked. Hakim shrugged with a gesture of resignation. "I don't know if I really managed," he admitted. "I just kept going. When Cecilia left, I thought I might follow her, that I'd lose myself too. But I felt I had to stay, in case one day she decided to come back. I never left the house, even if it meant living alone with those memories, those ghosts. Every day I waited for her." Hakim's simple words carried a heavy weight, the weight of someone who had remained standing purely out of hope, a hope that never completely faded, though it wore him down a little more each day. Laura felt a deep respect for this man and the silent pain he carried with him. More than ever, she felt the need to do something, though she wasn't sure exactly what. "I want to help you," she murmured finally. "Not just you, but Cecilia too. I know it may seem too late, but I can't ignore what I feel. Vinicius meant everything to me, and if there's any way to ease, even just a little, the pain you carry, I want to try." Hakim looked at her with a mixture of surprise and hope. "Would you do that, even knowing Cecilia might not want your help?" Laura nodded firmly. "I understand that she may blame me, and I'm ready to accept that," she replied with determination, though her voice also reflected genuine compassion. "But I also know that Vinicius wouldn't want his mother to suffer like this, and if I can do anything to ease her pain, I have to try." Hakim remained silent, processing the sincerity in Laura's words. He knew Cecilia still bore an enormous grief, but Laura's willingness to face it and try to help was something he hadn't expected. "Cecilia is a strong woman," he said finally, "but even the strongest sometimes need help." And there, on that park bench, something began to change. Two people, separated by a shared tragedy, were now united not only by their love for Vinicius, but also by the desire to heal and find a path to peace. Laura didn't know what the meeting with Cecilia would be like, but she was determined to do whatever it took to help her. She reached out to Hakim, who held her hand gently in a gesture of mutual acceptance and support in that shared silence. That moment in the park seemed to seal a silent promise. They knew the road wouldn't be easy and that the wounds still hurt, but this first step for both of them was already a beginning. The sky had clouded over, and the air felt colder, as if reflecting the tension of the encounter that was about to happen. Laura and Hakim walked side by side, crossing streets that felt emptier and quieter than usual. Each step felt heavy, and Hakim kept his gaze down, lost in thought. He knew where to find Cecilia. She had frequented the same places for years, but still, an inevitable fear overtook him. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, hesitant, as they approached a poorly lit plaza with a row of benches occupied by figures wrapped in blankets and worn clothing. "Cecilia. She's not easy to reach, especially if we're talking about Vinicius." Laura took a deep breath, feeling the pressure in her chest, but replied firmly, though her voice revealed a certain gentleness. "I know she may be resentful, even angry, but I can't leave her like this. If there's any chance of helping her, I have to try." Hakim nodded, though there was a hint of fear in his eyes. He admired Laura's courage, though he also knew Cecilia wouldn't make things easy. On a worn bench, Cecilia was sitting, wrapped in layers of faded clothing. She was staring at the sidewalk, her gaze distant, as if her mind was far from there. Hakim pointed with a slight nod and whispered, "Yes, that's her." Laura watched her for a moment. Cecilia looked older than her age suggested, as if the years and losses had drained her vitality. Her once well-kept hair was now tangled under a worn hat, and her posture reflected the weight of someone carrying an immense burden. As they approached, Cecilia looked up, and her expression changed immediately. First, there was a flash of surprise upon seeing Hakim, but her eyes soon narrowed when she noticed Laura beside him. "What is she doing here?" Her voice was harsh, almost a growl. She stood up quickly, a mix of anger and pain in every gesture. "She has nothing to do with this." Hakim tried to calm her, his tone pleading. "Cecilia, please, we just want to talk." "Talk? About what?" Cecilia snapped, standing with a hard, defiant look. "Do you think you can just show up and fix everything?" "Hakim, Vinicius is dead." Cecilia's words were direct and raw, and Laura felt the impact in her chest like a blow. She took a step forward, trying to stay calm. "Cecilia, I know this is hard," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I know you have many questions and that there are things that have never been said. I'm here to listen and try to understand so that maybe we can find a way to move forward." Cecilia let out a bitter laugh, devoid of joy. "Move forward? Do you really think that's possible after everything that happened? You're the one who took my son away from me." Her eyes fixed on Laura's, full of reproach. "He left because of you. You made him believe he didn't need us, and then he died alone, and you let it happen." Cecilia's words were harsh and unfiltered, and though Laura felt the impact of each one, she didn't look away. "That's not how it was, Cecilia." Laura responded, struggling to keep her composure. "I never tried to take him away from you. Vinicius was going through struggles that no one understood. He felt pressured and lost, and we tried to find a way out together." Cecilia's voice rose, breaking. "If he was so lost, why didn't he come to us? Why didn't he come home? You pushed him away, and now he's gone." Tears began to fall down Cecilia's face, and her anger transformed into a deep lament. "He's gone, and I'll never be able to see him again." Hakim stepped forward to console her, but stopped, realizing that this was a pain he couldn't ease on his own. Laura knew she had to say something, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. She took a deep breath, and although it was difficult, she chose to tell the truth. "He wanted to come back, Cecilia," she said, her voice breaking. "He told me many times that he wanted to make things right, to find a way to fix what was broken, but he was afraid. He thought he'd let you down, that there was no longer a place for him in the life you had planned. I didn't push him away. It was his way of coping with everything he was feeling." Cecilia looked at her, and for a moment her expression softened as she processed those words. "Did he say that?" she asked in a whisper, vulnerable in a way that Laura hadn't expected. "Yes, he did," Laura confirmed, moving closer slowly, as if afraid to startle Cecilia. "He talked about you, about Hakim, about how much it hurt him not to be the son you both wanted. He carried a heavy guilt, just like I do, for not being able to help him enough to prevent his end. He loved you, Cecilia. He never stopped loving you." Those simple yet sincere words broke through Cecilia's defenses. She looked at Hakim, seeking confirmation, and he nodded silently, his gaze full of support. Cecilia hesitated. Her anger was fading, though the pain was still evident in her eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered, as tears began to fall. "I just wanted him to know that there would always be a place for him, that we still loved him. But he left before I could tell him." Laura felt a lump in her throat, seeing Cecilia's vulnerability. "I can't bring Vinicius back," she said, stepping closer, "but we can honor him together. We can try to heal these wounds so that his pain, and the pain we still carry, won't have been in vain." Cecilia looked at her, her eyes shining with a mixture of conflicted emotions. "And what do you hope to accomplish with this? Do you think this will give me peace?" she asked, though her tone was no longer as harsh. It sounded weary, with a desperate wish to find something, anything, that could ease the endless suffering. "I don't know," Laura replied honestly, "but I want to try. Maybe, if we find a way to move forward, we can live in a way that honors Vinicius's memory. I'm sure that's what he would have wanted." A long silence followed. Cecilia looked away, as if waging an internal battle, trying to decide if she could allow herself to hold on to the hope Laura was offering. In the end, she sighed and looked back at her. "I don't know how," she admitted, "but maybe we could try." It was a fragile beginning, but Laura understood that Cecilia's wounds would not heal overnight. Still, that small sign of openness was enough to keep moving forward. She extended her hand cautiously, and after a moment, Cecilia took it with a light but firm grip. Hakim watched the gesture, tears in his eyes, knowing it was the moment he had waited for all this time. The morning was cold, and a light drizzle was falling, speckling the ground with shimmering drops. Laura made the same walk as a few days ago toward the plaza, where she knew she would find Hakim and Cecilia. After the painful encounter, many would have seen Cecilia's resistance as an impossible barrier to overcome, but not Laura. Something within her, perhaps a mix of guilt and hope, kept her from giving up. She knew she had to try again and keep trying as many times as needed. She carried a bag with a few things, a simple gesture that had become part of her routine. As she arrived at the plaza, she saw Hakim sitting next to Cecilia, who maintained a serious and distant expression. When Cecilia saw Laura approaching, she briefly lifted her gaze, but quickly looked away, as if wanting to avoid any confrontation. However, she didn't get up to leave, and for Laura, that small act was already a tiny sign of progress. "Good morning," Laura said, offering a gentle smile as she placed the bag beside them. "I brought a few things that you might enjoy." she added in a calm, careful voice, as if stepping into unknown territory. Hakim thanked her with a nod. He knew that Laura's persistence was more than just courtesy. There was a deep purpose in her actions, something perhaps even she didn't fully understand. "Thank you, Laura," he said, beginning to take items out of the bag. "You've been very kind." Cecilia didn't say anything, but she watched out of the corner of her eye, trying to understand the intentions behind each of Laura's actions, as if searching for answers in them. Laura's gestures reflected a mix of skepticism and curiosity, as if she were looking for a reason not to believe in the young woman's sincerity. Days passed, and Laura kept returning, never forcing long conversations or trying to get Cecilia to speak more than she wanted to. Instead, she brought hot coffee in disposable cups, freshly baked bread, and sometimes small treats. Little by little, Hakim and Cecilia began to appreciate it. Cecilia began to share small details about her day, simple stories of things she had seen on her way to the plaza, or a funny anecdote she had overheard. These were gestures that didn't require responses, but created an atmosphere of familiarity. Although Cecilia remained guarded, something was beginning to shift. She still avoided prolonged eye contact, and her answers were brief and monosyllabic, but her posture was no longer so defensive. Laura noticed that Cecilia was listening to her, paying attention, even if she didn't comment. It was as if a part of her wanted to engage, but something kept her trapped, preventing her from opening up completely. One day, when Hakim went off to get something, Laura and Cecilia were left alone for a few minutes. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken words. Laura sat beside Cecilia, keeping a respectful distance, and finally spoke in a low, reflective tone. "I know it's still hard to trust me, and maybe I can never change what happened, but I'm here because I believe Vinicius would want you and Hakim to be happy and to find some peace." Cecilia didn't respond immediately. She looked out toward the horizon, watching the gentle sway of the trees in the wind, and then, almost without realizing it, began to speak. "I just wanted him to know there was still a place here for him, somewhere he could come back to." Her voice was so quiet, it was almost a whisper, as if she were speaking more to herself than to Laura. "But he never came back, and I feel like it was my fault." Laura's heart sank at hearing those words. It was the first time she had seen Cecilia show a glimpse of vulnerability. "Your pain isn't your fault," Laura said softly. "He was afraid too, afraid he wouldn't be accepted, afraid he had let you down. I feel guilty too, Cecilia. For years, I've thought about how I could have done things differently, how I could have helped him more." Cecilia finally looked at Laura, her eyes filled with tears, but without anger. "You say that, but I always thought he left because of you, that you took him from us." Laura took a deep breath, feeling the weight of so many accusations and misunderstandings. He pulled away because he felt he needed to find his own life. It wasn't easy for him. There were so many expectations, so many dreams that weren't his, and when he tried to explain, he felt he wouldn't be understood. "He told me this, about his fear of disappointing you and Hakim." Cecilia closed her eyes, letting a tear slip down her cheek. It was an old pain, but it still felt as sharp as the day it began. "I should have seen it. I should have done more." "We all think that," Laura replied gently. "We all believe we could have done more. But Vinicius never stopped loving you. He always cared, and maybe he wanted us to find a way to be happy, even without him." For the first time, Cecilia seemed to grasp the meaning of those words. She didn't respond or pull away. She simply remained silent, letting the weight of what was said sink in. "I don't know if I can forgive myself," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can move on." Laura moved a little closer and carefully placed her hand on Cecilia's. "I don't know if I can forgive myself either," she admitted, "but maybe we can try together to make his memory more than just pain, to make it something beautiful, something that brings us peace instead of suffering." Cecilia didn't respond, but she didn't pull her hand away. They remained that way for a few minutes, sharing a moment of vulnerability and understanding. It was a small, fragile first step, but a significant one. There was much to overcome, but there, beneath the light drizzle and grey sky, something seemed to have shifted. A barrier had broken, though subtly. When Hakim returned, he found the two of them sitting side by side, their hands still clasped together. Something warmed in his chest at the sight. He knew the road would be long, with setbacks and difficulties, but that simple gesture meant more than he dared to hope. Cecilia looked at him, and on her face was an expression he hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't happiness, but a small, almost imperceptible sign of acceptance. In the days that followed, Laura continued her visits, and little by little, Cecilia began to join the conversations, though shyly. Hakim noticed that she was more present, that her responses were no longer just out of courtesy, and he dared to ask Laura about her day, a small gesture of interest that might have gone unnoticed, but that meant a lot to Laura. Small gestures of trust began to emerge, like timid sprouts breaking through once barren ground. Cecilia started accepting Laura's help with less resistance, and even allowed her to take some clothes to wash, something she had refused countless times before. In that moment, Laura knew she was on the right path, and that despite all the challenges, there was hope. The journey toward reconciliation was only beginning, and Laura was well aware that she couldn't rush it. The healing process moved forward, and as Hakim, Cecilia, and Laura walked together, even if slowly, the air filled with the hope that one day the pain that bound them might transform into a force that could heal them. The move to Laura's house took place on a sunny morning, as if the day itself was celebrating this small step toward a new beginning. Cecilia and Hakim had finally accepted Laura's offer. For Cecilia, it was a difficult decision, as she felt caught between distrust and hope, but deep down she knew that moving forward was necessary. In the solitude of her grief, there was nothing that could bring Vinicius back or erase the feelings that consumed her. Laura took care to prepare everything to welcome them, making sure the atmosphere was warm and inviting. The rooms were arranged with fresh linens, and open windows let the sunlight flood in, brightening the spaces. Upon arriving, Cecilia hesitated at the entrance, pausing at the threshold, as if the new reality before her still felt like a distant dream. Hakim encouraged her, taking her hand firmly yet gently, and together they crossed the doorway into Laura's home. The first week was a period of adjustment. Laura knew she couldn't force things. Cecilia still held back somewhat, as if waiting for something to confirm her fears. However, little by little, she began to relax. Daily life brought small routines that helped create a sense of normalcy. Each morning, Laura brewed fresh coffee and Hakim made toast, while Cecilia, a bit shyly, ventured to help by cutting up fruit. It was a simple division of tasks, but for them, it meant a great deal. It meant they were together, collaborating as a family. In the evenings, they gathered around the table for dinner, a ritual Laura was determined to maintain. Though initially there was some discomfort in their conversations, one night while they were dining, Laura prepared a dish that Vinicius had loved. Without any warning, she said with a gentle smile, "Vinicius taught me to make this, though he'd always say I never seasoned it quite right, but he'd still eat it anyway." The comment surprised everyone, and after a brief silence, Cecilia, to Laura's surprise, let out a laugh. That's how he was. He liked to tease, though he never really complained. It was a short laugh, but a genuine one, and Laura realized that they had taken a step forward. Life at Laura's house began to settle into a routine, filled with small gestures of kindness and mutual support. Little by little, Cecilia and Hakim found ways to reciprocate what they received. Hakim, always active, spent his mornings tending to the garden, an activity that brought him peace and helped distract his mind from darker thoughts. He began planting flowers, and Laura would join him, listening to his stories as they worked together. Cecilia, in turn, started helping in the kitchen, and their afternoons became moments to experiment with new recipes, something Laura had always wanted to do but had never found the time for. Laura noticed something she hadn't seen in a long while. Cecilia seemed less tense, Her face still bore the marks of her pain, but there were moments when she allowed herself to relax, and her smile would return, even if only subtly. One afternoon, while they were folding freshly laundered clothes, Cecilia confessed to Laura that she still missed Vinicius every day, but had come to understand that she couldn't keep bearing that pain alone. Laura looked at her with understanding and replied, "You don't have to anymore. We're here together." These small moments of sharing were significant, almost imperceptible in their simplicity, but they represented great progress. It was as if they were rebuilding their lives bit by bit, brick by brick, with each smile, each shared memory, and each story that kept Vinicius present without making pain the center of everything. One of the most memorable moments in this process happened one afternoon in the garden. Laura had suggested they spend the day outside, enjoying the sun. Hakim got his hands dirty planting, while Laura and Cecilia arranged a small space with chairs and cushions. After a while, the three sat down, and without anyone planning it, they began to talk about Vinicius. With a calm, nostalgic tone, Hakim reminisced about what Vinicius was like as a child, how he used to help in the garden, and how his eyes would light up every time something new bloomed. He said that flowers were like little miracles, and perhaps that was why Vinicius had loved life so much, even when things became difficult. Cecilia listened intently, and after a long silence, decided to speak up. "I've always wondered if he knew he could come back, and that we'd be here for him, no matter what happened." Her voice was filled with emotion, but she didn't shed tears. Instead, she looked at Laura and said, "Thank you for helping me remember that. I was lost in my pain, but you brought back something I thought I'd lost forever." Laura was deeply moved by Cecilia's sincerity. "I was lost for a long time too," she admitted. "But being here with you has made me realize that we can find glimpses of happiness even amid sadness, and those moments can help us move forward over time." She realized that her home had become a refuge not only for Hakim and Cecilia, but for herself as well. Taking care of them, sharing laughter and even tears, had allowed her to process her own pain in a way she had never been able to before. Cecilia and Hakim's presence was healing her, filling an emptiness she had always felt. Cecilia, who at first feared growing attached to this new routine, began to see their life together as a source of strength. She realized that accepting Laura's help wasn't a sign of weakness, but a way to find the strength to move forward. One morning, she suggested something that surprised everyone. "Maybe we should organize a dinner to say thank you. I don't know exactly how, but I think it would be a good thing." It was a simple idea, but to Laura and Hakim, it meant a lot. It was proof that Cecilia was allowing herself to embrace her new life, not forgetting Vinicius, but also not drowning in his memory. She wanted to create something positive, celebrating the present rather than merely lamenting the past. The dinner became a symbolic event, a milestone in their transformation. During the preparations, Cecilia and Laura laughed as they chopped ingredients, while Hakim, as always, took care of the flowers, filling the table with small arrangements he had gathered from the garden. When night fell, they all gathered to toast in memory of Vinicius. Hakim raised his glass and said, "To Vinicius's memory and the strength that has brought us here." The toast echoed through the house, and each of them felt the sincerity of that moment. They knew there was still much to heal, and that some scars would take time to close completely, but together they were beginning a new story, a story where pain didn't need to be forgotten, but could coexist with hope, love, and the promise that, despite their losses, it was still possible to find joy. In this way, that thread of hope, which at first seemed fragile, grew stronger and more solid, weaving a new bond between Laura, Hakim, and Cecilia, united by a love that remained alive in some way through them. The next morning shone brightly, as if the sun was smiling in celebration of a special day at Laura's house. There was a different energy in the air, a mix of anticipation, nervousness, and joy, as it was Cecilia's birthday. Laura had planned a special lunch to mark this new chapter, an occasion symbolizing much more than just a date on the calendar. It was an opportunity to let go of past burdens and embrace a new beginning. In recent months, the lives of Hakim and Cecilia had changed dramatically. Laura's constant presence, the peaceful routine, and the small gestures of care and understanding were slowly healing wounds that once seemed impossible to close. The house was no longer just Laura's. It had become a shared home where everyone contributed and found reasons to smile again. However, Laura had a secret she was eagerly waiting to reveal that day. She had been organizing every detail of the lunch throughout the week. The table was set in the garden, decorated with flowers that Hakim had carefully selected and gathered. Cecilia had helped by choosing the dishes and even suggesting some old recipes she used to make for Vinicius. This gesture showed just how much she was opening up to new possibilities. Gradually, she was accepting the love and support surrounding her, and that deserved to be celebrated. "You seem nervous," Hakim commented to Laura as they arranged the dishes on the table. He looked at her with a gentle yet curious gaze. "I'm fine," Laura replied, smiling and trying to hide her anxiety. "I just want everything to go well today." She knew that the moment about to unfold would be a turning point for all of them, and she couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions washing over her. Cecilia, who had remained silent near the table, looked at Laura and then at Hakim. "Whatever you have planned, it will be special," she said with a calm, affectionate voice. "After all, you're the one behind it." It was a short sentence, but loaded with meaning. Allowing herself to believe that someone was doing something for her from the heart was a big step. When the clock struck noon, Laura looked at Hakim and Cecilia, took a deep breath, and knew it was time to reveal her secret. "I want to introduce someone very special who has always been part of my memories of Vinicius and who I hope can now also be part of our lives," she began, feeling her voice tremble slightly. At that moment, a boy of about 9 years old appeared in the house, with slightly wavy brown hair and eyes sparkling with curiosity. He approached, smiling shyly, as if unsure what to expect. "This is Tiago," Laura said tenderly. "He is my son, and also Vinicius's son." She paused to observe the expressions of surprise on Hakim's and Cecilia's faces before continuing. "Though he's on vacation at my parents' home, they adore him, and he always looks forward to this time with his maternal grandparents. I wanted to bring him here today because I believe he deserves to meet his other grandparents, and I also believe you deserve to meet him." The impact of her words was immediate. Cecilia put her hand over her mouth, stunned, while Hakim seemed to be trying to process what he had just heard. "Vinicius's son?" Cecilia murmured, almost in disbelief. The words echoed in her mind, like something she had never imagined hearing. Laura nodded, feeling tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "I found out I was pregnant shortly after Vinicius left," she explained, her voice choked with emotion. "That was one of the reasons the pain was so hard to bear, but I knew that in some way he would always be with me through Tiago. And now, I want him to be part of your lives, just as I want him to know the grandparents whom Vinicius loved, even if he never got the chance to say it." Cecilia stood still for a moment, as if Laura's words needed time to reach her heart. Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long time, she began to cry uncontrollably. Hakim, too, felt the emotion well up inside him. His eyes were damp, though his tears were a silent cry of relief and joy. He looked at Tiago and saw something familiar in him, a smile, a sparkle in his eyes that instantly reminded him of Vinicius as a child. "My God, he looks just like Vinicius when he was little," Cecilia murmured through her sobs. She stood up and approached Tiago, kneeling down to his level. "Hello, Tiago," she said with a smile that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "I'm your grandmother, and I'm so happy to have you here." Tiago, who had been shy at first, smiled and threw himself into Cecilia's arms, as if he instinctively knew that this was where he truly belonged. It was an embrace that lasted several seconds, a moment charged with years of unexpressed pain that was finally being released. Hakim came closer and joined them, gently placing his hand on the boy's head with the tenderness of a father, wanting to share all the love he had held in his heart without knowing who to direct it toward. Laura, watching this emotional scene, let her own tears fall, feeling that they were finally beginning to heal. After this touching moment, everyone sat down at the table, and lunch began. The atmosphere was light, filled with smiles and spontaneous laughter. Cecilia, who had previously been reserved during celebrations, was now more alive than ever, asking Tiago questions, eager to learn all about him, what he liked, what his dreams were. Hakim, in turn, watched each interaction with a joyful expression, as if witnessing a miracle. During lunch, Laura shared little stories about Vinicius that she had never told before, and this time, the memories brought not just sadness, but also a deep sense of peace and joy. Tiago listened attentively, smiling and laughing at the stories that made him imagine his father, whom he had never met. Thanks to the words and gestures of those around him, Vinicius felt more present than ever. At the end of lunch, Hakim raised his glass to toast to new beginnings. With a firm but emotional voice, he said, "To the moments that give us a second chance to be happy, and to Vinicius, who lives on in all of us, especially through Tiago." Everyone raised their glasses, and the toast was accompanied by smiles and glances that exchanged a silent promise. From now on, they would be a united family, not by the past that separated them, but by the future that brought them together. The day passed lightly, and as the sun began to set, bathing the garden in golden light, they all sat together on the grass, enjoying the moment. Cecilia held Tiago's hand, while Hakim embraced her at the waist. Laura watched them all and felt, for the first time in a long time, a deep peace. Not because the pain of losing Vinicius had disappeared, but because, through Tiago, she found a new way to love and honor his memory. The child's presence represented a new beginning, a promise that life goes on, and that it is possible to find happiness even after the greatest losses. Tiago, with his energy and curiosity, was the living proof that the love Vinicius had left in the world was still blooming and would continue to do so. Finally, the sun dipped below the horizon and night fell. But inside Laura's house, the light had never shone so brightly. Now together, they were not just people united by the pain of loss, but a new family bound by hope, love, and the desire to continue healing and living. Thus, amidst laughter, memories, and affectionate glances, they began a new chapter, one that did not deny the past, but chose to look toward a future where the memory of Vinicius was not just a shadow, but a light guiding each of them toward better days. Did you enjoy today's story? If so, subscribe to the channel, like and share it with your friends. See you in the next video.